Hi, everyone. Greetings. I know you're in different time zones around the world, so I won't attempt to greet you according to your time of day, but I will say warm wishes from Texas. We've just been through a significant snowstorm. We got through that okay, and now we're probably headed toward warmer weather, which is welcome for me since I enjoy gardening when I'm not at work. So I'm a senior designer and accessibility advisor at USAA. I've enjoyed working there since 2007 when I began as a UI designer, and almost immediately saw that there was a gap in our understanding about what it takes to make a digital interface accessible. And so I voluntarily became the subject matter expert for accessibility for all of USAA, and remained in that role for about the first 6 years of my time there. And then subsequent to that, we sort of developed into an accessibility operations group, added more people and more roles. And now I continue to serve with interest in universal design, but I'm mainly concerned with the materials. And I've stayed in that role because of my passion for interface design accessibility. So without further ado, I'll kick into our subject for today, which is forming an enterprise accessibility training program. And what I'm going to present in these slides, I'm hoping is something of a manifesto for those of you who may be already on your journey or maybe just beginning your journey within an enterprise organization and still sort of need some guidelines, or I would like to say waypoints, by which to mark your journey. And so what I offer are not really eight ordered steps. Rather, they're just milestones that you can look at. And some of them you end up revisiting as a training program grows and encompasses more roles and reaches more of the enterprise endeavors. So we begin with the first milestone, which is to scope the accessibility training landscape. And for that, we need definitions. I'm going to try and define accessibility, what a program is around accessibility, and what it means to be enterprise in that context. So our first definition pertains to accessibility training itself. And as I mentioned, when I was in my first 6 years, I did a lot of the training myself. I had two exposures working for states on opposite coasts of the United States of America. And in both cases, they were operating with accessibility guidelines. And USAA had a lot of learning to do when I first began my time with them. I didn't come up with this definition at that time, but after some reflection, I've come to the realization that all accessibility training is the transfer of awareness, so that's disability awareness, of knowledge pertaining to what it takes to make an interface usable or an experience usable, and the skills, which is the know-how, things that you need to know in order to make things or do things. And we wanted to be able to transfer what awareness we had. There were areas in which we still needed to grow, but we wanted to transfer that knowledge and those skills to any trainee whose role in the company or in life or in business would be to carry that knowledge into their skill set and to be able then to serve the needs of people with disabilities. So whether you were creating content online or actually engaging people in a service-oriented role, we wanted you to be able to have the awareness, the knowledge, and the skills needed to do that. And to carry this understanding of what accessibility training is, the transfer of these knowledge, skills, and awarenesses into a program status, it was going to require a significant amount of rigor. And so we took that same definition of accessibility training and have broadened it into a sort of a more rigorous plan where we could monitor it and measure by it. It would have to become industrialized in that sense in order to fit our needs. So I defined it in this way. An accessibility training program is a standardized and curated set of accessibility training guidelines, materials, and methods that is regularly refreshed and transferred to trainees. Here we come with that transfer of knowledge again, whose awareness, knowledge, and skills for serving the needs of people with disabilities is by it, that is by that set of accessibility training guidelines and materials, regularly measured. So it puts a container around accessibility training and turns it into a program that you constantly monitor and measure. And in that way, you're constantly improving it. And it is something that's subject to compliance rules and regulations, which makes it sort of industrialized and ready for distribution and promotion. So what makes an accessibility training program enterprise level? For this, I thought about it a little bit, and it was just sort of something that needed to be large scale, and it needed to be intrinsic to the nature of the company. It couldn't be just something that was a package sitting in one region of the company. And so for that purpose, I said, these are the characteristics of an enterprise program. It needs to be systemic, meaning that it's distributed among lines of business, locations, and time zones company-wide, so that the skill set and the tool set and the mindset of the company was ubiquitously aware of and ready to embark on that knowledge that was necessary to do the business that that company is in. In our case, it's financial services at USAA. So something that's systemic is infused into the company. Something that's scalable then would be broad ranging. It had to be capable of reaching a vast number of employees who work in diverse and specialized customer provisioning roles. And not only did it need to be broad ranging, but it also needed to be varied and peculiar. And that's what I mean by extensible. It means that it could be adapted to the specialized knowledge areas and practices of each role. And we ended up defining, at least as a working foundation, several roles that we thought we could train to and focus our training objectives around then. And that was the general employee. That's just the sort of the all roles in common for awareness training and some level of training around knowledge and skills, but very high level. But then driving into more specialized roles, we knew that copywriters would need some exposure, certainly UI designers and developers, very specialized interest in designing accessible interfaces for engaging our members and the public, as well as the testers who would basically act as the user during the process of testing those interfaces for usability, including testing with screen readers and Zoom magnification and other forms of interaction. But it also extended to marketing and our customer service reps as well. And these are very different media spaces, marketing especially, since you're dealing with print media, large scale, as well as video production. So all of those have sort of a learning curve when it comes to accessibility, but they're very different roles. And so to that extent, to be extensible means that you've got to be able to adapt to the peculiarities of those roles in ways that don't become redundant with the general employee training. So the second milestone in this journey, and you don't have to visit these in order, as I've mentioned, they're just waypoints on the journey, or mapped to the space of accessibility. They're waypoints that you may have to come back to again and again, but one of them is to assess the enterprise problem space. With the enterprise level of training, there are essentially two big problems that I was trying to get my head around early on, and it took some years actually, and other, I didn't do any of this alone, believe me. I have some great colleagues who are highly skilled in both managing and production and other skills that they bring to the table for which USAA can be very grateful, because my skill set was fairly limited to just the interface design accessibility. But one of those enterprise problems that we had to overcome with regard to a training program was the inability of accessibility experts to train across all other expert knowledge disciplines. And the difficulty here is it's just a big knowledge gap. For example, I know very little about the service industry. We have MSRs, we call them member service representatives. They're essentially the customer service representatives who manage calls and complaints and handle requests over the phone, sometimes on chat. That's a service area that requires a certain degree of expertise. And so in order for us to overcome the accessibility barrier there, it would require some level of awareness of what it takes to be a member service representative. And those are things that not every accessibility expert has in large numbers. So that was one of the gaps, was the knowledge gap. And the other was what I would like to call the availability gap. The inability of a small number of accessibility experts to scale training to a wide range of training situations and schedules. I'm not speaking here about the availability of training materials, which, if you have a learning management system, it can be always available. I'm speaking here specifically with respect to providing training in a variety of situations in all the ways in which training can be provided, whether it be live sessions or PowerPoint led or experiential things, or even in the case of service representatives to do scenario based training with people. There just aren't enough of us to be available, not only online on Zoom, but even in situations where you have to do real world live training. So it was going to have to go beyond us, is essentially what I'm saying in all of this. We were going to have to enlist help from other lines of business and other roles within the company to advocate within their own areas what that accessibility training was. And I have these closed doors here kind of representing the silos of lines of business and the special knowledge that's in each one of those areas. And we had to engage them all. Of course, we could invite people to come out of those doors and meet in the lobby with us. And that was sort of the approach that we took, rather than having to engage each one individually. And that just made it a little bit easier, at least the concept of being able to do that made it a little bit easier. So there were several essentials that we thought would have to be part of an enterprise training program. So for example, the training materials themselves would have to be compliant with accessibility law and industry standards. That's just a must-have for the materials themselves. The development of it would have to be inclusive of trainees by abilities, roles, lines of business, and so forth. Learning objectives would have to be role specific for each customer facing experience and for service reps as well. So front lines who create content for members who touch that interface, touch the glass, so to speak, as well as people who engage face to face. Training would have to have a review cadence that was recurrent in order for it to be truly enterprise, truly robust and measurable. And we would have to make sure that training was part of a scheduled process of exposure, whether at the moment of hire or on a regular basis recurring. Training deployment would also have to be comprehensive, meaning that it would have to reach every employee in that role, whether they be true employees, full employees, or hired contractors who are essentially acting as employees in that situation. It would have to be monitored for training attendance and for the success of the training through assessment, through testing as a result of the training. And then finally, it would have to be curated. The body of material that we use for training, as well as the as the test results would have to be curated so that we could manage that. That, of course, would have to be done centrally, but we needed the cooperation of all the lines of business outside of the accessibility operations group to handle that training. So our third milestone was to segment this enterprise problem. And for that, we were going to need some help. And in fact, there had to be some background. This is one of the missing ingredients that I learned early on. The first 6 years was like swimming upstream, trying to convince the enterprise of the importance of accessibility. We got a lot of, the standard responses. Why is this important? It only touches a few people. Why am I responsible for this? That kind of pushback initially. We don't get that anymore. And the reason we don't is we now have a company-wide accessibility policy. And putting that policy in place was like, watch the dominoes fall. Because once you have executive endorsement at a corporate level, and it aligns to the Americans with Disabilities Act about non-discrimination, everything then flows from that. And it has made a profound difference in the mindset of all lines of business at every level of management across the company. From the policy, which was essentially a commitment to make sure that everything was accessible from the standpoint of our public and member experience, we also then drew out several standards. And these standards touched in various specific areas, whether they be the physical facilities, the ICT procurement, it's information communication technology procurement. We're still working on that one, but we've broached that barrier. Now we're in a conversation with people in procurement to make sure that employees are getting what they need, and that experiences that are public facing are also provided with equipment that meets those standards. Customer service interactions now are governed by a whole knowledge base of procedures that accommodate to the needs of people with disabilities and follow ADA standards. We have standards for third party that we're just engaging in now, and we're developing that fully, and as well as complaint management. That standard has been in place for some years now to how to manage complaints in a responsible and timely way to make sure that people with disabilities get the accommodation requests that they need. And last but not least, because this is where we began, we want to make sure that all our digital content aligns to the WCAG standard. And we have our own USAA standards for digital accessibility that align to the WCAG, but also supplement them in some ways in a centralized repository. Now, none of this is training per se. It sets the background for it, though, in ways that are quite impactful. And having this infrastructure in place means that we can then begin to build on the requirements that we've created for facilities and the requirements that we've created for digital documentation and marketing, and begin to train to those standards. But for that to take place, we needed to form an enterprise training governance platform. And the very first thing first in importance, it wasn't the first thing we knew about, was the legal layer of that repository of requirements. It just so happened that our legal counsel was able to give us a number of guidelines, high-level business requirements that they developed from existing federal regulations as well as case law. There is no statute or mandate that says a company must train on the subject of accessibility. Almost all the legal precedents are based on the execution of the skills that lead to accessible websites or an accessible service experience. And so to that end, we really needed the help from legal to create high-level business requirements out of those case laws and regulations, so that we would have something that we could work from that would have the authority of the law, but it would be within the company. So it would be more on the compliance level rather than on the regulatory level. And we ended up with 9 of these. I cannot show you what they are because of attorney-client privilege, but I've created at least a mock version of what a business requirement would be. It would have a high-level description of what the directive is, which would order a specific training action and its action agent who would be responsible for it, whether it's an affiliate, a third party, or an employee, or somebody in a service role. We would set the scope very clearly then as to the subject and the audience of that directive and any impacts that it would have, the application in lines of business, because we just wanted to make sure that we were specific enough that we could turn this into role-based training and make sure that we align to these high-level business requirements when we build our training modules. One of the first things that you have to do as you're creating this enterprise program is identify your company's frontline roles. We began with a set of roles. It's not as far-reaching yet, I think, as it's going to be, but we decided that anybody that was creating content that a member had to engage in directly, or that was creating a service experience that had a direct face-to-face or conversational exposure, was going to be a role we wanted to train to. These roles would be content providers, and they might be service reps as well. And these are people who would engage other people who have disabilities. They would either engage them directly or indirectly with the published content that they create. These roles, the frontline roles, are the highest accessibility risk to any company. And so these are the roles that we wanted to train to first. In a distributed corporation, frontline trainees may be under separate managers from the accessibility governance group. That is certainly the case in a big company like USAA. We have affiliate organizations as well as many siloed lines of business. And they each, interestingly, had already to some extent created their own accessibility training materials. Sometimes they would gain from the general accessibility awareness training that our group provided for the whole company, but they also had specialized needs within their own lines of business, and they began to ask questions and move on their own. In some cases, they would be using third-party accessibility training materials, and we didn't discourage that. In fact, we welcome it. But what it did entail is, if we're going to have a program, we were going to have some way to measure the success of that material, because there was no way for us to control all of the ins and outs of what the material they were using. We at least had to assess it, measure it against our own learning objectives, and then supplement it where we felt we had learning objectives that needed to be addressed that weren't being addressed by the materials they were using. So prioritize your trainee roles. You may need to start small. We started with people who are engaged in the digital interface experience as well as member service roles, the MSRs. And these were our roles, as well as the top level. Every employee at USAA should have at least some exposure to general accessibility awareness training. So that was the common roles. Then the designers, of course, they're the ones who are engaged in the sort of the user experience. Developers, they're more focused on the system and the robustness of serving many platforms. Testers who would act as advocates, voice of the member, voice of the public, to ensure that everything was following WCAG standards. And then finally, the MSRs, the member service representatives. And it was an interesting experience. I had an opportunity to engage our service representatives in some training, and I learned an awful lot from them, probably more than they learned from me. But it was great to be able to get them, to enlist them as the experts in their area, and to sort of expose them to what accessibility standards there were. Some of them were already fully engaged because we had a complaint process that was managed by another member of my team, and she had done an outstanding job of engaging them on, in that training area. But there was still not a regular sort of vetted and controlled system of learning objectives until we got together with one another and began to form them. So in order to form some learning objectives around your training, you're going to need to enlist your company's frontline roles. You have to enlist trainers from various lines of business. And if you think of it, these are like horizontal silos within any company. And they have specialized roles within each of those silos that we know nothing about. And without a doubt, when they're large enough, like our corporation is, they have their own trainers, and they train to the subject of their expertise. And one of the things that we've found helpful was to engage those people who are actually doing that training. In some cases, it will be people who are specialized trainers. They're professional trainers in the subject areas for which they've been hired. In other cases, it'll be just those leads who are specialized in some skill set for which they are the key person to train other members of their team. But the key was to connect with them, with those business and experience owners in each line of business, and to ensure that whenever they do their training, that they incorporate accessibility into those modules of training. So we had to explain our training program and why collaboration with a centralized accessibility governance was key to fulfilling our corporate compliance with regard to our policies, our standards, and our requirements, and to sort of homogenizing that experience. And we did do that. We've done that with both all the roles that are like designer developer. Each of those is in a guild. And if you think of the role specializations are kind of like the horizontal grid. Many of those roles, like designer role, will be across the various lines of business. So you got the vertical silos of the lines of business, and the horizontal roles and the skills that they train to across the range of the company. And somewhere in that grid is the meeting of the specialized needs of each line of business with the skills and specialized skills, in some cases, of each role within that line of business. So we began to invite role-specific trainer delegates to an annual accessibility training summit. We began our first one about 3 years ago, and we were able to engage our digital content creators in that summit. We actually called it Denali. So we've had Denali 1 and Denali 2, and we're going to do Denali 3 this year. And it's just a high mountain in the United States. It's in Alaska. And we were also able to create another similar summit for service representatives. And they were so different in kind, and the problems that they deal with are so different in kind from the kind that digital content creators deal with, that we thought it was important for them to have their own summit. So we called that St. Elias, which is the second highest mountain in the United States. It's also in Alaska. So that was just something we were able to do. And we were also fortunate to have members of our team, some of whom have disabilities themselves. And it's always important, and we've made this, even if they're not part of our team, we engage people who have disabilities to come and speak to the needs that they experience. And that exposure, not only through formal training, but even through user groups that we have on our campus from time to time, has been greatly influential in sort of changing the tide of the way USAA thinks about accessibility and its responsibility in that regard. So milestone 5, form accessibility learning objectives. What this is in the program of training, this is kind of like the No Child Left Behind set of standards that was a federal set of standards for all education levels, for the primary grade levels of students in the United States. And by setting a standard threshold for each grade level, for each subject in that grade level, the No Child Left Behind policy was able to standardize the methods by which we would measure the learning of students in America. And I took that practice as something of a model for how we build an enterprise training program. And what it entailed was we were going to have to create learning objectives, and we were going to have to do it in collaboration with those who train in each role. So that meant that frontline trainers would have to understand the work of who do understand the work of frontline content and service providers. We're going to have to contribute some of these learning objectives. This is an actual learning objective from our general common role training. It's the first of many. And it was just to articulate the risks involved in failing to present accessible experiences to prospects and members. And for each one of these learning objectives, we were going to have associated tasks that a trainer would do, like list the corporate cases, key ones, estimate lost return on investment, and so forth, similar things to that. And then the measurable outcomes, things that we could test for as a result of the training session. So after training, we could ask a test question, give an example of or cite a legal case, and maybe give multiple choice answers and where they would have to choose the right answer. So this is standard learning pedagogy approach. You train to the objective, the outcome, and then you measure the success of your training by asking questions. What we found is that we had to create as many learning objectives for each competency or role as were needed by that role in order to mitigate the risk of trainee incompetence. We just simply didn't want people out there who weren't able to create great user experiences that meet the needs of people with disabilities. We didn't want that to happen, so we thought, well, what do we need to train to? What are those what's that minimal threshold of learning objectives? And then we created associated training tasks for each learning objective, and we finally created measurable outcomes for each of them. And so for the Common Core, we had some 26 objectives that we wanted everybody in the whole company to know. These are the 26 things, and we actually created a general accessibility awareness training around that. It is now part of compliance training. It is required annually, and we have to revisit it and assess it to make sure it's current, up to date, and that the contact information in it is accurate. So that's one of the things we do. We also had a number of other frontline roles: the designer, developer, tester, and service rep. And each of those had a special set of learning objectives in its own space. And in order to avoid the problem of redundancy, we basically created some I guess you'd call it kind of an aggregate specialization, so that the training learning objectives that we had for all roles in common wouldn't become unduly redundant and repeated for those UI designers who had to take the 24 learning objectives in their specialized area. And so what I've created is kind of a Venn diagram made of 4 ellipses, and the top of the diagram has one focal point of the ellipsis governing the 26 learning objectives for the common role. And then each of those ellipses branch out and fan out in different directions to cover the 24 learning objectives for UI designer, 24 front-end developer learning objectives, 13 accessibility tester learning objectives, and 13 service rep learning objectives. And they do total 100. That wasn't by design. Next year it'll probably be 101, or we'll see. But it was a way of ensuring that we were training in a way that meets the needs, the specialized needs, without being unduly redundant. Milestone 6 is to form an accessibility training curriculum for each of the specialized roles. And that would mean that accompanying the learning objectives would have to be an outline that sort of structures what it is about those learning objectives that need to be taught, and in what contexts and what materials could be used. So a curriculum, in a formal sense, is a template. It's not the syllabus, it's not the actual course material, but it is a structure of those things that need to be taught, and it presents it in an organized way so that it can be used as the basis for creating actual training. I've looked at other curricula models, and it came to the conclusion that we needed a list of intended outcomes. Those are the learning objectives, a summary of a training goal, as training needs, trainee needs. They're varied. Almost all of our trainees are employees. So this was an employee-facing experience to equip our employees to meet the needs of people outside of our company, our members, and the public. It had to summarize available training resources. We have quite a few resources within the company, but it was important that for certain specialized roles, there were certain training materials and media that were available to them that might not be available to other groups. We wanted to know what those were and to make use of those within those areas. The key thing to remember in all of this, as you create a structured curriculum for each role, is that a curriculum should be results oriented. It's all about the outcomes and ensuring that you've got your success measures measure those things that you've trained to, and that you do get some sense of progress over time as you measure it from year to year. So let's just begin with the training goal. For each role, that's designer, developer, MSR, and even the general common training, you wanted to have a statement of that role. And so for the common area, for example, this is sort of the one goal that governs all of the training in that area for all roles in common. Every employee has awareness of the range of human disabilities and of provisions that need to be made for all products and services to be accessible. That's the overall governing principle by which we train. And if we have to refine it over time, in the light of more insights, you can do that. But you're focused in on that one role. Even the generalized role is a specialized role when you think about it, because what can you train to that applies to everyone? And so you really have to think about what are those things that everyone has in common within the company. But it applies also to other specialized roles. We wanted to make sure that we understood trainee needs, and these are general. They may lack exposure to disabilities or accessibility design needs, so they're going to need new information on what an accessibility provision is and what a disability is. Some trainees lack any connection to people with disabilities, and so at first it may have seemed irrelevant to them, but I think bringing people into the training who have disabilities suddenly makes that very relevant, and it has been a sea change at USAA since we began to do that. Some trainees may have difficulty adjusting the settings of the learning materials themselves, whether it be video-based training or computer-based training. We want to make sure that the training materials that we provide and the methods we use are themselves accessible. And it's always important, especially when you're doing live training or training over Zoom, to ask in advance of your trainees if they have any special accommodation needs, because you may need to provide sign language interpretation, for example, to some employees. And so those kinds of accommodations and just becoming aware of those is an important aspect of the training, the range of trainee needs. And then some trainees may require assistive technologies and adaptive strategies. Many of them already have these within their workspace, but owing to the fact that many of us at USAA have now been working from home for the last year because of COVID, we may need those specialized tools and provisions in our home space as well. So just being aware of those specialized needs and articulating them in your curriculum is very important. Some available training resources. We've got LMS training, computer-based training, video-based training, PowerPoints, and the like. You'll have your own specialized, mechanisms, and it's important that you at least articulate those, know what's in your inventory, and be able to leverage those when you think it's the most appropriate way to present information. When you have your learning objectives all sort of gathered together, then you got to sort them and categorize them by their various types. So some are going to be related to legal and regulatory. Even for a specialized role like developer, there are some legal and regulatory things that they need to know, some business requirements and operational related accessibility rules that they need to know. And so you organize that material for them in the curriculum and present it in a way that other trainers can then, within those specialized lines of business, can appropriate and can build into their training materials. To get to become fully sort of enterprise, you've got to inspect your training resources. And we spent the last year actually going over those training materials that we reuse within specialized areas. There were design specialization training, and there was also some specialized training. We actually made use of the DQ University materials in some cases. It wasn't necessarily required training, but it was training that we recommended, and we vetted those materials against our own learning objectives. Did we find gaps? Yeah, sometimes we found things in the DQ University materials that we liked, and we actually added them to our learning objectives. And in other cases, we had learning objectives that the DQ materials didn't quite meet in the specialized way that USAA wants to train to accessibility. So we had to create gaps, and then our plan was to supplement that material through creating our own training resources that can supplement the materials we get from third parties. So whatever third-party training material you use, you want to manage those accessibility training standards in such a way that you've got some kind of regular sort of authoritative body that can look at those materials and get a report on where was the alignment, where were the gaps, and are you remediating those gaps on a recurring basis, and then provide a record or report of the approvals that were made. We called our group the GREATS, the Group for Review of Enterprise Training Standards. We had to create a charter with the roles and responsibilities for that group and a member roster. Some of them were from our own team of accessibility experts, but in many cases, these were people in lines of business whose role was simply to be aware that there were accessibility learning objectives and curricula for each of these specialized roles in their lines of business, and to be the promoters of that so that they would participate with us and at the same time be able to promote that knowledge in the company. We have to convene at least once a year in USAA. It might be important to convene more often should there be changes in the regulatory environment or new high-level business requirements from legal. It's important for everybody to be aware of what changes and when so that we can be timely in our distribution. Having delegates in various lines of business will help us to monitor and assess the training materials and schedules. And so in every specialized line of business, whether it be banking or life insurance in our company or the various lines of business that you may have in your company, you want to make sure that you're mitigating risk on a recurring basis and that you're assessing and monitoring the training that goes with those risks that tries to reduce the risk for the company. So you need to create an inspection process and regularly review the training requirements and guidelines for currency and relevance. It would be important to have at least some event that has to take place on a regular basis and evidence that event took place, whether it's meeting minutes to say you approved the following changes, or some kind of an assessment, maybe a test that gets run on the training materials, something that proves that the inspection took place. That would be a control then for that inspection process, and then require regular reporting of those inspections to make sure that the training materials that are being used are current, they are being reused on a recurring basis, that we're measuring against the success of the training by looking at test results on average, and making sure that everybody who's in a particular role is getting trained on a regular basis. And if people are skipping training, that's something probably that their manager needs to know about. And so this kind of rigor over the training program then turns this program into something that is truly enterprise level. And wherever there are gaps discovered, either in the training materials or the rollout, the deployment of the training, we want to remediate those as quickly as possible to get that done. And our last milestone is to nurture the accessibility training discipline. This is something that we do by hosting regular training summits. We convene role-specific accessibility trainers to refresh and reinvigorate them. The beautiful thing about this is it is an exclusive event, but it's an exclusive inclusive event. I kind of like the idea of that. We want to limit attendance to the training leads and delegates, among whom should be people with disabilities, so that it becomes an enriching experience for everyone. Collaborate with participants to set the agenda. I remember this quote, I can't even remember who I heard it from first, but you can achieve anything you imagine in life, but you can't do it alone. So you want to enlist training leads and delegates from each of the lines of business and get them to be, to add sort of accessibility to their arsenal and be the champions within that region for training. And then create group interactive experiences. And it just depends on what you have available, you know, for your breakout sessions during the summit. Usually it's either a whole day or a half day summit. You can use box notes or mural to unleash creativity, and then focus on achievable outcomes. Our first summit, our first Denali, we actually created the learning objectives. We didn't have them all done yet, but at the end of that session, we had created a number of learning objectives in each specialized role of those who had been invited to the meeting. So you really do want to accomplish, moving that goal marker down the field in the course of your summits. And so this is I think this is my last substantive slide. Make sure you make heroes out of all the people that help and support in the training role. Meet throughout the year, at least once a quarter, to stay fresh and engaged. Encourage newcomers to take on new challenges. You know, don't be afraid to give somebody, to delegate a responsibility. People like that. Enrich veterans with new roles and responsibilities so they don't get stale. Share knowledge among the disciplines and avoid a single point of failure expertise. It's great to have people who are knowledgeable, but you've really got to shadow those experiences so that you get more than one person with that expertise. And then celebrate accomplishments of groups and individuals. And this is a people thing, but limit the proud, lift the humble, and above all, love one another. So that's all I have for today. I'm willing to take some questions and answers. I'll provide what answers I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rod. That was great. We do have some questions here. We do have a couple minutes, so I will just dive right in. Okay, this one had a lot of upvotes to it. Any advice for a small team of designers and developers currently learning accessibility who are in charge of training on accessibility to all their development teams and PMs and getting everybody on board in a big company, but they don't have time assigned for it or budget to do it, or and any good resources to use for this?
The nice thing about PowerPoint or the like, or is that it's fairly cheap. The only thing that you have to do is create the content, and that's kind of how I began. I had a set of training materials that I would reuse, and I would invite large groups of people to take the training, and it was live and in person at first. We didn't use Skype or Zoom too heavily then, but we use it quite a bit now because our company is very distributed now, much more so than when I began. So it's easy, cheap to create that kind of training material. And if you get an ordered training, so that's a good way to start. And of course, you're not delving into anything other than what you already know at that point. To do the kinds of things that we've done, to go into those specialized areas that we don't have a whole lot of experience with, does require enlisting the help of others. But you can even do that with the training materials you provide. Enlist the help of others to come and participate with you in those Zoom training experiences. Even if you don't have a high budget, where you can't afford the DQ University training modules, there's plenty of training material out there that's free and available if you want to make use of it. but you do have to vet it because it's not going to meet all your needs. So it doesn't absolve you of responsibility from creating your own learning objectives. You do need to have a set of standards that you say, this is us. This is what we train to based on each role within your company.
Got it. Okay, I think we can squeeze in just one more question here. How did you get leadership buy-in for this training program, both in C-suite and also in team and departmental supervisors?
Well, in a measure, I've been doing it for years, and so I've been known as an accessibility expert since 2007. But I was also delegated this role. It was something I loved to do, and so fortunately for me, my director just said, you're going to be doing this. The buy-in really comes as a reflex of the fact that we have an accessibility policy. Once we got that policy and the standards in place, and those weren't specifically about training, but they were about the outcome of training and making sure that we were aligned to the ADA and the WCAG standards. Once we had those in place, it wasn't a far distance. And then just recently gaining the high-level business requirements from legal as well gives us even more impetus within the company, because now it's a compliance-related issue and it's going to drive out. So having those points of leverage is critical. And then all I got to do is sort of drop the weight of accessibility training on one end of that lever and watch the big stone roll. That's essentially what happened. So, yeah.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rob, for a great session. Thank you to everybody who joined. We do still have a handful of sessions left, so I hope you guys enjoy the rest of AXCON. And yeah, thanks again, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for attending, everyone.
Thank you.